Good afternoon. Today's speaker is Janice Yan. Janice joined my lab in her second year many years ago. She did a few independent research projects, ending with a wonderful thesis, co-authored 3 papers, not too bad for an undergrad. And then she joined the lab of a superstar, where she started to do research on ants and also discovered her true love, which are bedbugs. Who doesn't like bedbugs? The superstar faded very quickly, and Janice requested to move to my lab for her PhD. It was easy to accept Janice, but the bedbugs, I was more reluctant. But there was good rationale for studying the bedbugs, and I'll let Janice.
As many of you know, I recently finished my PhD in this department, and so I'll be excited to talk to you guys about all of the research that I got up to. So before I get into my talk, I just want to acknowledge everyone on this slide for making all of these projects possible. Advisor Ruben Dukas, along with my committee members. And then I'll discuss the foundations of classical sexual selection theory, followed by a project where we explore the social consequences of sexual conflict. Then I'll pivot into polyandry. We'll talk about what that is, why that's important, and how it affects fitness and behavior in both sexes. We'll talk more about the adaptive significance of polyandry, and then I'll end with what I think some of the main takeaways and conclusions of my PhD work were. So my research largely focuses on studying sexual selection. And sexual selection is a mechanism of evolution that is concerned with how individuals compete with members of the same sex for matings and fertilization. And understanding sexual selection is really important and broadly interesting to biologists because it really shapes the way that animals both look and behave. So one thing is that sexual selection can help us understand some traits that natural selection alone would not be able to explain. So it has some really strong explanatory power. And it also helps us explore some of the most salient and interesting features of animals. So this includes aggressive contests or fights that we see. It also includes bright coloration sometimes, and elaborate courtship songs and dances that we see here. So this is very interesting, I would say, to both biologists and also the general public. We see a lot of nature documentaries on a lot of the interesting traits and behaviors that sexual selection generates. Beyond that, sexual selection also comes up very frequently in human research. And so sexual selection plays a role in how we as humans perceive faces, voices, status, and attractiveness. And it might even help us explain the evolution of creative processes like music and art. And so because there's so many different research areas that draw on sexual selection theory, I think it's really crucial that we have a really solid understanding of how it operates in both of the sexes. And so to understand how sexual selection works, it's worth going back to Darwin's initial observations that helped establish the field. And so what Darwin cleverly noted first was that typically we see males as the sex that possesses secondary sexual characteristics. So these include weapons like these ornaments, weapons like these antlers on these deer that they use to fight, to acquire mating opportunities. And it also includes ornaments like the peacock's tail that attracts females. So typically we see males with these traits rather than females. Additionally, more often than not, when you watch animals in the wild, it's the males that are the ones that are pursuing the females rather than the other way around. And the females appear to just passively, which is a way Darwin put it, but passively choose between the males. And while these two observations were really important in starting this field, Darwin himself couldn't explain what was going on and why this was happening during his lifetime. It wasn't until 1948 when this guy named Angus Bateman came along and ran some experiments on fruit flies that we came to understand ultimately why we see these patterns in male and female reproductive behavior. And while these experiments have now been heavily criticized, and there's a whole literature on criticizing Bateman, the insights were still really important for helping us understand sexual selection. So what this insight was is that because males, by definition, produce small, energetically cheap gametes in much larger numbers compared to females who produce smaller, energetically rich gametes, larger, energetically rich gametes, male reproductive success tends to be constrained by access to females, or more importantly, their gametes, whereas female reproductive success tends to not be constrained by access to males and their gametes. And as a result, we've come to these theoretical expectations where we think male reproductive success or male fitness is going to increase with the more mates that they acquire, whereas females, for a long time, we predicted that they don't really have much to gain from mating beyond just 1 or 2 times because they can just get so many gametes from few matings. And later in my talk, I'll talk about how this framework might be overly simplistic, but for the most part, it's worth mentioning that generally, with newer data that we have, male mating is still, males still benefit from mating at a higher rate than females on average. So because you can have this disparity between how often males want to mate versus females want to mate, you can get something called sexual conflict. And this is when the reproductive interests of the two sexes are at odds with one another. So again, in many cases, males often want to mate at higher rates than females, and this can lead to conflict. And this sexual conflict is a really powerful evolutionary force. It can lead to the evolution of some pretty extreme morphological traits, like hooked and barbed genitalia that we sometimes see in males. So this helps males prolong mating duration, often at the expense of female fitness, so it can sometimes injure females. And we also see the evolution of some pretty extreme behaviors like infanticide. So in some cases, we see male animals killing the offspring of females, which is not good for the females, but it's good for the males because it makes it more likely that the female might mate with these males instead. And so again, it's an example of how sexual conflict can lead to some pretty extreme behaviors. However, one element of sexual conflict that we think has not been really well studied is how it operates in the context of social groups. So often animals do live in groups and interact with each other. And when animals live in groups, this increases the likelihood or the frequency that you're going to have antagonistic interactions occurring between the sexes. So while the subfields of sexual conflict and social behavior are often studied in isolation, we think it makes a lot of sense to look at how processes from each field interact with each other. Specifically, what we wanted to look at is how sexual conflict might influence social behavior. We thought perhaps the threat of engaging in costly interactions with males could lead to female social avoidance strategies, which could in turn influence the overall population structure of animals. And we decided to approach some of these questions with a network-based approach, which is where we watch a bunch of freely interacting animals, and we look at how they interact in a group, and we map all of their interactions. Okay, so to study this interaction between sexual conflict and social behavior, we decided to bring bed bugs into the basement of this building. And the reason why is because they're a really good model organism for our question. So bed bugs, for those who don't know, reproduce via obligate traumatic insemination. This means to mate, instead of going through the female genital tract, the male simply stabs the female in the middle of her body with his copulatory organ, and he deposits the sperm straight into the female's body. And for a long time, this made bed bugs kind of a poster child of sexual conflict because just at face value, this looks like a very harmful behavior to the females. We also use bed bugs because, again, we're interested in this interaction between conflict and social interactions, and bed bugs are social. So often bed bugs like to get together in these aggregations where there's just a bunch of them all stacked on top of each other in a group. And so our major question was, in a species with so much sexual conflict, with this extreme mating system, do we see it affecting their social structure of populations? And how we approached this question was we designed a new semi-naturalistic arena, which is essentially a big plexiglass box. It's not as naturalistic as a bed and a human, but we couldn't get that ethically approved, and so we kept the box. But I would argue that this is still a lot more naturalistic than watching bed bugs in a little petri dish. This lets us watch many, up to 24 individually marked bed bugs at a time. They have a bunch of little shelters, crevices that are very high quality that they can move between and hide in. They can choose where they want to go. And we also provided them with a heated blood source over here so that they could feed undisturbed. So this really gave us a novel way of looking into how bed bugs behave. And what we did was track 6 populations of bed bugs with 12 males and 12 females. This is what it looks like in the lab when we're actually watching the bed bugs. So as we know, they're nocturnal, and so we want to study them when they're most active. And because of that, we watch them in the dark. So this is me with an undergrad student. I guess he's a grad student now, but that's Jack. And we're watching bed bugs. And the reason why it's red is because most insects don't see red light. So in this case, it would seem completely dark to the bed bugs. And when it comes to tracking social associations, what we're doing is scanning the population of bed bugs every hour during their active time, so during the dark period. And every hour, we're marking where each bed bug is and who they're aggregating with. So here you can just see that the 3 bed bugs over there in shelter number 2 were marked as being in an aggregation together. And so we consider them socially associating with each other. With this data, we're able to construct social networks like this one, where each of these circles or nodes represents an individual bed bug, and the connections between the nodes represent an association index. So this is just a way of quantifying how often 2 individuals were seen in the same aggregation. And in our networks, we had the size of the nodes correspond to something called network strength, which is just the sum of the edges. And basically how this works is that bigger nodes were just more socially connected. They were either seen with more individuals more often, or they were more often in aggregations. And again, we were looking for evidence that females might be avoiding males at the network level. So we thought there was 2 possible mechanisms by which this could be happening. One is females could just choose to be less social. If being in an aggregation means you're going to be harassed a lot, females might on average be less social than males. Alternatively, if females still want to reap any potential benefits of being in a group while mitigating the costs, they could also choose to preferentially aggregate with other females. So if this was the case, we would see what we call phenotypic assortment by sex at the network level. But in other words, we would see distinct clusters of only female aggregations and only male aggregations. So this is what our 6 networks look like. We had an additional shelter manipulation where the top networks had fewer shelters, so that's why they're more dense. But the results ended up being the same across the 2 treatments. So if you're interested in that, you can read the paper. But what hopefully you can tell is, first of all, females were not any less social than males overall. If this were the case, those orange nodes representing females would be smaller on average than males. And we also see no signs of females disproportionately associating with other females. So most of the aggregations were kind of randomly or evenly divided by sex. I know this one looks like we have this distinct female group and this distinct male group, and that if you did notice that, that's a good thing because this one network is significantly phenotypically assorted by sex, but we determine on average when you only have 1 out of 6 networks showing this pattern that generally we don't really see evidence of this. And so this was really surprising. Like I said, traumatic insemination sounds like a very costly thing to be happening, and yet we don't see evidence of females avoiding males, at least when we test them in groups. And so we wanted to understand what was going on at a more individual scale. And so we decided to test the preferences of females individually by giving them a choice between a shelter with only female social cues or a shelter with only male social cues. And now when we do this, we see that when given the choice, females do really prefer to go towards other female social cues. So if we give them a choice of who they want to hang out with, it is other females. It seems like at the group level, they just aren't able to get away from the males. And so what we conclude from this is there seems to be sexual conflict over the ideal composition of social groups, meaning when we're looking at social behavior, it's probably important or at least relevant to consider how sexual conflict could be influencing social processes. Okay, so now I'm going to slightly pivot. What I haven't mentioned yet is that while doing this first project, we also decided to track all of the bedbugs' sexual interactions. We had this new arena and design that let us observe bedbugs at a much finer scale than anyone has been able to do before. And so we wanted to take advantage of this setup. And so on top of watching and taking scans of the bedbug social groups, we also continuously watched them and documented every mount that occurs. So that's when a male attempts to inseminate a female, like you see here. And we also documented every instance of an insemination, which you see here. And what we quickly realized is that bedbugs form these really neat, dense, interconnected insemination networks. So here, all of the boxes on top, the orange ones represent females, the blue ones are males at the bottom, and the lines between tell us when a mating occurred. And what you can see is most of the females are mating with multiple males. In fact, on average, the females mated with about 4 to 5 males over the 6-day period, meaning that the females are mating polyandrously. And this is really interesting to us because, like I said at the beginning when we were talking about classical sexual selection theory, females are theorized to not really benefit from mating at these higher rates. And so we wanted to understand what the fitness consequences of these higher mating rates are. Is it beneficial for the females to mate polyandrously, or is it because the males are perhaps dragging the female mating rate up because it benefits the males? So to answer this question, we took females and we had them inseminated by males once every day. This represents basically the natural rate that we saw in the arenas. And then we compared them to females that were inseminated at a much lower rate of once per week. And by sufficient, I mean that these females, though they were mated with at a much lower level, they were never sperm depleted. And importantly, we also controlled for harassment using males that had their genitals superglued. So how this works is that because the daily insemination females got exposed to a male every single day, we wanted to make sure that these females also got exposed to males every single day, but didn't mate daily. And so on days when the weekly insemination females were not supposed to mate, they got this superglued male that could still chase and mount the females, but could not proceed with insemination. And this lets us know that any differences we see are because of mating itself and not because of differential exposure to males. Okay, so what we find is that realistic rates of traumatic insemination are really costly to females. So this is a survival curve, and what it shows us is that by the time all of the high insemination rate females died, most of the females getting inseminated once per week were still alive. So there's this big lifespan difference. Essentially, realistic rates of traumatic insemination are killing the females. We also see that the low insemination rate females lay eggs at a faster rate. And so when you combine those two results together, we see that the low insemination rate females produce significantly more lifetime offspring. They have much higher fitness than the daily inseminated females. And so the takeaway from this is that the natural rates of polyandry we're seeing in bedbugs are not good for the females. It seems like the males are driving the mating rate in this system. It tells us that it indeed is a very high conflict system, and that, at least in bedbugs, polyandry doesn't seem to be beneficial. Because we're interested in behavior, we wanted to see how females might be responding to this. So while we didn't see evidence of social avoidance at the group level, when we're watching the bedbugs, we often saw that in response to getting mounted by a male, you see this female here very overtly trying to run away and get this male off of her back. So that's the male mounting the female, and you can see her running away, trying to get away from this. And so we predicted that because realistic rates of getting inseminated is costly to females, we would see females displaying this type of avoidance behavior at higher levels if they had recently just been inseminated. And while polyandry has important consequences for females, it also has really, really important consequences for males. So when a female mates with 2 or more males in short succession, the sperm of these 2 males are now competing with each other in the female reproductive tract. So polyandry, or females mating multiply, actually introduces a whole additional arena of sexual selection that we call post-copulatory sexual selection. So this is competition between males, in this case, after mating occurs. And so we think the males should be highly sensitive to this. And we predicted that males should prefer mating with females that have not recently mated, because then they would not be experiencing as much sperm competition. They don't have to compete with the sperm of other males if this female had not recently mated. And here you can just see, this is a close-up of a male bedbug's copulatory organ, and there are taste receptors at the end that are actually there to detect the presence of other male sperm. So they do seem to be highly sensitive to sperm competition. Okay, so how we tested our predictions about female avoidance and male rejection behavior is that we went back to this arena design, except this time we manipulated the females so that half of them were recently inseminated and the other half were distantly inseminated. So by recent, we meant they mated 2 days prior and also right before the experiment, while the distantly inseminated females only mated 2 days before the experiment. And then we put in 12 standard males to interact with the females. And again, we predicted that the recently inseminated females would be more avoidant of males to reduce the cost of multiple mating, and that males would also treat the recently inseminated females differently. They would reject them more often to avoid sperm competition. And again, we went back to the lab and we watched them in the dark, this time for only 1 hour at a time, and we ran 5 total replicates of this experiment. And really importantly, the observers, Jack and I and some other students, we were always blind to female treatment, so we didn't know which females were recently versus distantly inseminated. When it came to quantifying their sexual behaviors, what we did was every time we saw a mount happen, we recorded who was involved in that interaction, and then we scored whether the female tried to avoid or whether she stayed. If the female tried to avoid, she could have either successfully gotten away or she could have failed. And in cases where the females failed, we kind of grouped them with cases where the females stayed. Because of all of these cases, the males now had a choice between aborting or proceeding with insemination. And so this way we could score female avoidance rate based on how many times females attempted to avoid. We were more interested in how much they were trying rather than how successful they were. So this attempted avoidances over mounts. And when it came to male abort, we could score that by looking at how many times they aborted over all of the cases where they actually had the choice. So cases where females stayed. And when looking here at proportion of mounts that led to insemination or insemination rate, what you can see quite clearly right away is that mating status did influence how likely females were to get inseminated. So more mounts directed at distantly inseminated females led to insemination. The question is whether this is driven by the females being more resistant or if it's driven by males being choosy. And what we saw surprisingly was actually no evidence of any difference between distantly and recently inseminated females in terms of how resistant they were towards the males. So unlike what we predicted, the recently inseminated females were not running away or trying to run away at higher rates than the distantly. But when it comes to looking at male rejection rates, we now see this really strong effect where males are rejecting recently inseminated females far more than they are distantly inseminated females. So in other words, what we see here is some really strong evidence of male mate choice. It means the males are being choosy and they're actually rejecting mating opportunities. And we think this is a particularly striking and interesting example. One, because male mate choice kind of goes against this classical sexual selection prediction that males should just try to mate as much as they can, indiscriminately, because their fitness is linear when it comes to mating. But it's especially interesting in a species like bedbugs because the males don't provide any paternal care. They also don't have any elaborate courtship patterns. And so the males in the species really are just investing sperm and seminal fluid alone. And even then, we still see this really strong male mate choice. And lastly, it was interesting and surprising that we didn't see this increase in resistance in the females. And so what we decided to do was just take detailed video recordings of 13 females as they received 6 successive inseminations over 6 days. And now what we see when we look at proportion of time females spent evading males was that after the 3rd consecutive insemination, we do see this increase. So females do have this plastic avoidance behavior that increases based on their insemination history. It seems like they just perhaps tolerate the first 3 matings before they start displaying this avoidance behavior. And this is interesting. It could be a sign that up to 3 matings is either not costly or potentially even beneficial for the females. So here's a quick summary so far. We see high rates of polyandry in bedbugs. This is costly to female fitness. Sorry, there we go. This reduces female fitness and thus influences the behavior. We see this increased resistance. And we see that polyandry also has really important consequences to males and can lead to male mate choice. But what I've yet to emphasize is that polyandry is not something that is unique to bedbugs. So the first 100 years of sexual selection research actually largely neglected the existence of polyandry altogether for a couple of reasons. One, because we talked about how theoretically we just don't really expect females to be mating at higher rates, and so people really focused on male multiple mating rather than female multiple mating. I think a second reason is because male scientists likely projected their biases about women's sexuality onto non-human animals, and so we get this neglect of female multiple mating for a very long time. But 3, it is also worth noting that female multiple mating is a lot more elusive and difficult to see in nature. A lot of species, it can happen rather quickly and fairly discreetly. And so for a number of reasons that I just mentioned, we really ignore the existence of polyandry for a very long time, up until the 1970s, where scientists studying insects in the lab started to report that the female insects they were looking at were mating at higher rates than we predicted. And even more interestingly, often in some species, it was actually the females soliciting the males into mating. And then later, when we start to get genetic tools in the 1990s, we start to solve some of this elusive and discrete mating problem because now we can do paternity tests on the offspring of animals in the wild. And what researchers found out was that a lot of birds that we previously thought were monogamous were actually engaging in extra-pair copulation. So they were mating with other males that were not their primary partner. And so birds mate more polyandrously than we previously thought. And now with decades more research on a variety of different taxa, we now know that polyandry is a phenomenon that's really widespread in the animal kingdom. Females of many species often mate with multiple males. And this begs the question of whether these higher rates of female multiple mating are due to males just dragging the female mating rate up, essentially coercing the females to mate at higher rates than are good for the females, just like what we saw in the bedbugs, or if it's possible that polyandry could be adaptive or beneficial to females in other cases. And to study this, it's worth really understanding the costs and benefits of mating for females. And so females, the costs typically involved increase mortality in one way or another. So mating can risk injury or infection for females. It can increase predation risk, and it also just comes with opportunity costs. So time spent mating could be spent doing something more productive instead, like feeding and egg laying. However, females can also derive benefits from mating with multiple males. And the major benefit and the most empirically backed benefit, especially in arthropods, is gaining nutrients and resources. And so this is very obvious in species like the scorpion fly that provide females with a nuptial gift. So this is every time the male wants to mate with a female, he has to bring her a prey item that she can eat. And so if you mate with more males, you get access to more of these free meals. But even in species without nuptial gifts, females can still get a lot of nutrients from mating multiply. So typically, and especially in arthropods, so that's like insects, males are not just transferring sperm when it comes to mating. They also transfer a cocktail of seminal compounds and proteins that typically can stimulate fecundity, so they can increase female egg-laying rate, so they can be very nutritious. And so if females mate with more males, they get more access to these nutritious compounds, and they can increase their fitness. In other species, more often bird species, females can also gain more paternal care when they mate with multiple males. So if you have 2 males contributing to your offspring, that could be beneficial. But generally, we're kind of focused on the nutritious benefits of multiple mating. And so to understand whether polyandry is going to be beneficial to females, it's important to look at the net effects of the cost and the benefit curves. So what we think is going on with the costs is that it's likely to be linear because every time a female mates with a male, she's exposed to the same suite of costs. However, we think the benefits function is likely to follow this diminishing returns curve. And so beyond then, there really aren't any additional benefits to mating at even higher rates. And this would result in a net fitness curve where female fitness because a lot of studies only compare to mating and exposure to sexual harassment have often the easiest way to manipulate and then the female or because